Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Iqra Book Festival. Those of you who have been eagerly awaiting the next interview, the joys of technology, we were just getting everything connected. Now I'm going to hand over to Daoud Duncan, who's a performer himself from the West Highlands of Scotland, and he draws on the deep wellsprings of Scottish traditional and Islamic culture to share profound music, storytelling and song. So over to you, Daoud.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello there, Sidra. Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be back here at Iqra Book Festival for a third time. MashaAllah, it's such a brilliant endeavour, really important as well, and I hope that this does well. I was really excited, actually, got called in a wee bit last minute to put together the interview for this amazing book, and it was actually the introduction to this book that I got. Muslim Networks from HAJJ to Hip Hop was released in 2005 as part of a series, Islamic Civilization and Muslim Networks. This book actually covers the concepts of the networked Muslim civilization throughout time. It looks on the concept of Muslim networks as a combat against kind of a homogenization of the idea of Muslims, as well as looks as network as a process by which Islam is imagined and put into practice by Muslims as well. It's a fantastic read full of excellent, an excellent diversity of different essayists from different fields, fields of humanities, arts, social sciences, etc. And ultimately has this fantastic through line that gives us this real kind of counter to what I suspect at the time was, let's say a substandard appreciation of how complicated Islam is and was at the time. So I would like to say a huge welcome to Miriam Cooke and Bruce Lawrence to the Iqra Book Festival for the first time. Who knows? This could be the start of something even bigger as well, mashallah. And I'd like to ask you to introduce the book in your own words, as well as perhaps, if you've time and the ability, to give us a wee bit of a reading, if you'd like as well, if that's something you've prepared.
Thank you, Daoud. It's a pleasure to be with you. Do you want us to maybe quickly introduce ourselves so people know who we are?
100%, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, so I have been teaching Arab cultures ever since I graduated from Oxford, but I have to tell you all that I'm actually from Edinburgh.
Lovely.
The accent. And so I've published extensively on Muslim women's writings, but primarily Arab women's writings. Became very interested in Islamic feminism and currently working on something to do with Palestine during World War II. Bruce.
So my name is Bruce Lawrence, and I've been in the academic groove for over half a century. And I taught for 4 decades at Duke University, where Miriam and I are both professors in North Carolina. And the traumatic changing moment for my life was when I went to India in the mid-70s, and I thought I knew something about Islam, and then I got introduced to Indo-Persian Sufism, and I realized that I knew nothing. But I started to build up another category, another way of thinking, another set of relationships. And so when I came back from India, from Aligarh, I was at Aligarh Muslim University in Uttar Pradesh, I began to teach a course on Islamic civilization. And I tried to see Islam as part of global history and not simply as a separate annex of the West or the East or some other larger abstraction. And then Miriam and I were both so daunted by 9/11 and the response to it that we felt there had to be another way of talking about Islam and Muslims in the modern world than terrorists and extremists and Salafi boot riders. So what we decided to do instead was to organize a conference that then became this book, Muslim Networks, and that's why we're here today.
Excellent, and thanks very much. I thought it would be really appropriate to just kind of set the scene, as you've begun to do there, Bruce, of kind of what led to this book. You made it explicit in the introduction that your aim was to counter stereotypes. Certainly it was clear post 9/11, so soon after that, that was such a huge feature of wider society. I just wondered as well, certainly know from my experience of Islamic studies in the University of Glasgow, that still by 2010, when I was in there, this discourse of, are we getting it wrong as academics? Are we making mistakes in interpreting Islam was there. Could you kind of set the scene of what maybe the study of Islam in academia was like around about 2005, perhaps maybe stereotypes or things that have been were around at the time?
Well, as I think you mentioned in your introduction, the way this started was with 9/11, which is, I guess, your 7/7. So it was with the bursting onto the public sphere of the terrible Muslim, the terrifying Muslim. And Bruce and I had already been thinking about Muslim networks as an interesting way to refigure the way in which we and our students and our colleagues had been dealing with Muslim or Islamic cultures. And so we started this little project of Muslim networks, the Center for the Study of Muslim Networks. And then we get 9/11, and then suddenly the only network that anybody is listening to is Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram. And so we had to pivot from what we were doing in terms of, this new lens, especially in view of technology, information revolution. We had to start to think about how we were going to hold on to the notion of Muslim networks that, as you said so well in the introduction, is so powerful. And not to whitewash. So you can't write about Muslim networks. Many of the networks that you were talking about are networks of hospitality, of trade, of pilgrimage, travel for knowledge, talab al-ilm, hatta fi sin, look for knowledge, even if you have to go to China. And so those are the positive networks. But we couldn't in that period when we were inviting many people to come to give talks. We couldn't leave out in some ways the spark for this. And so we have Viktorovitz in this book where he talks about terrorist networks, but that was not our goal.
So I think the thing which might interest you most is that every book has its planned features of things that you try and do and organize and hope to do, and then it has accidental features, things you didn't plan, and sometimes the things that make it better than anything you could have planned or imagined. So one of the delights of our book is after we thought we'd done it all, we had this fellow student named Sami Alim come to us and say, you know what, you've done networks, but you haven't done music. Hey, dude, where's the tune? And so he said, I want to introduce you to this rapper named Mos Def. And Mos Def is going to tell you about Muslim networks, the Trans Global Hip Hop Nation Network. So it was so interesting that after we thought we had done a job of canvassing multiple perspectives, it's not that we're tone deaf, but we sort of been neglectful of other ways of thinking of networks, including musical networks. So Sami Alim was not at the conference, but his contribution became the reason we retitled the book From HAJJ to Hip Hop, not only because it rhymes, because it sounds like itself a hip hop jingle, but because Sami Alim was so convincing that you can't deal with global networks and call them Muslim unless you also deal with hip hop.
And he also challenged us and he said, I bet you guys, you fuddy-duddy guys who study Islam from a boring perspective, I bet you wouldn't include the work that I'm doing. We're like, oh yes, we will. So when we had the people come and give their talks, you know, Jamila Karim on Aziza and Carl Ernst on Sufi networks, and every time we had somebody give a talk, there would be in a room that would hold 70, there might be 30. When it came to Sami Alim's hip hop, they were hanging from the rafters. In fact, the room got so full that we had the police tell people they had to go somewhere. So we had to stream it somewhere else. And I think it's really also important to mention the timing of this, because at this point in 2022, there is much there that at the time was absolutely contemporary and urgent, that now is a moment in history. So, you know, Gary Bunk's work on
cyber networks.
Yes, I mean, he has written books since then. You should interview him about, and the crisis for him at that time was archiving. He's like, oh my God, there's so much stuff that's happening online, but we need to hold on to it. And of course, archiving is no longer the issue that it was then. It was also early in the days for women's networks. And so what was an insight from Taiba Sharif and Jamila Karim and Samia Siraguddin was that women who had been isolated, particularly if they were in either strictly segregated societies or in communities where that is kind of a norm, where they would not be able to be in touch with each other across space and time, as you mentioned, suddenly there were these new connections. And also there was the way in which many of us who have been very much involved in feminist networks, the network was by telephone. It was miraculous when we had video conferencing. It was like, oh my God, you know, we can talk to people in Cairo, and they can be in their place, we're in our place. It is on the screen that we come together. And so that created a whole new world of possibilities for Muslim women, because they were able now not to have to think about, oh my goodness, am I going to fly to Algeria, and how complicated it's going to be, and who can't make it, and who can't afford it. And suddenly we can all be together.
So the other thing, we haven't told you anything new yet, but we'll tell you something new now. Beyond Sami Alim, we had somebody else who was an interloper who wound up being an extraordinary expander of everything we did. His name is Tayyib Belghazi. So in the book, there's an afterword from a Moroccan social theorist named Tayyib Belghazi. And he said, basically, all that you're doing is explaining what we have been working on in Morocco for a number of years called barzakh. And he introduces the Quranic term barzakh and says barzakh is two things that don't have to choose one over the other. They both interact sometimes in ways that neither one knows, but it produces a new reality. And so he explores something that's not going back to an either or synthesis Hegelian mode of choosing the thesis, antithesis, and a new synthesis. He says you don't have this kind of teleological view. Instead, you have a constant balancing of perspectives. And that's what we try to achieve. But he told us more about what we did and couldn't do and should do in the afterward than we'd ever thought of before.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's one thing that I did notice, you know, as a Muslim reading this as well, that there was so much kind of familiarity. You know, the hip hop thing, myself, I became Muslim in 2006. You know, it's through hip hop, through this kind of global network and so on, that you'll be familiar with through. Now, I tell you this, it also raised, as a Muslim who's studied academically as well, you know, it was nice to see this insider and outsider perspective, as you said, is so important. I just thought, you know, just because we'll have a lot of Muslims, you know, listening, a lot of Muslims watching as well the festival, what kind of role do you see for the kind of insider and outsiders perspectives as playing in, you know, academia in Anglophone countries?
Well, there's a lot that can be said about insider outsider. The one thing that I think this whole experience of 9/11 and now Muslim networks and our book and the series in which it appears is insider outsider is now not so much a religious label as Muslim, non-Muslim, as a notion of where you stand in the perspective of Muslims in world history. And I think I say world history because it's not East and West, it's not Africa and Asia or America and some other place. It's always about how you see a central role for Muslims, but also you see Islam itself as part of world history. And that comes back to somebody who was both an insider and outsider named Marshall Hodgson. And so we use his notion from the Venture of Islam of Islamicate at several places to say, you don't have to be a Muslim to be appreciative of a Muslim experience in world history. And in fact, sometimes it's the person who sits on the margins who's not quite an insider outsider, but just an interloper. And I think that's what Miriam and I are. We're not insider outsider, but interlopers who share much of what we know because we've had not only associations with Muslim friends, but long times of teaching and residence in Muslim countries. And just so you know that the title of the book is From HAJJ to Hip Hop, which we thought was very uncontroversial. But when we tried to teach it in Doha, Qatar, back in 2010, a mere 12 years ago, people said, no, you can't do this. We said, why? Maybe they're going to object to the fact that we're non-Muslims. No, it was heretically using the title Hajj and hip hop because hip hop can never be equivalent to Hajj. Well, we never thought of that. And nobody who early read the book thought about it. But in Doha, a very conservative country, by having those two words together, Hajj and hip hop, it didn't matter whether we were insiders or outsiders. It mattered that we had violated a code that said Hajj is by itself. The arkan stand apart from anything else. And you can't compare it to hip hop. And what we were intending to do was not only get people to remember the title and to read the Sami Alim chapter first and then go back and read the others, or maybe practice a little music and then see if you can get anything else out of the words. Our real intention was to show that there is an insider-outsider communication that goes on through hip hop and through other parts of music. So it blurs the lines between Muslim and non-Muslim, between Asian, African, European, American. And that's really what was the intent of our book.
Well, yeah, absolutely fantastic. I think as well that this, the idea clearly, you're constantly in the book coming up against the limitations of network as a lens to view Muslims through, but obviously the usefulness of that as well. Well, look, I have to say, you know, it's 2005. It's a wee while ago, and I thought, kind of, you know, looking back academically with kind of a critical eye on things that maybe you weren't so happy with and so on. Maybe if I could start just with one idea which was so apparent is the internet, you know, would come up again and again and again. And of course, since 2005 to 2022, things are so different. Good examples would be things like this, talking about the, let's say, online dawah scene. Whereby people were able to be offered status. If it's okay to make I just thought it was a fascinating kind of insight at the time was, of course, the book starts with a exploration of Ibn Battuta and how he was, let's say, not the most accomplished of scholars. However, going into the Muslim, you know, countries, Muslim majority countries, his, let's say, relatively superior learning offered him status and even patronage and so on and so on. I think that it's quite funny, whereas back in the day in 2005, you said something along the lines of, I think I wrote it down as well, sorry, the writer had written down that the internet offers no financial reward whatsoever. In 2005, that 100% was the case, whereas now, there's huge debates, and the internet dawah scene sort of one of the most maybe interesting kind of networks, as it were. At the moment, there's a famous example just recently, controversy about a man who's looking at interviewing and doing dawah with Andrew Tate, the kind of famous sex criminal. I don't know if you've come across him. He's very popular among young people, extremely sexist, and so on. And as I say, he was been trafficking women, all these kind of things. However, relentlessly famous. But if you get what I'm saying is this Dawa interview with Andrew Tate, because Andrew Tate's an internet celebrity, does offer the potential for hundreds of thousands of pounds just for one video and so on. What I kind of wondered was, regarding the imagination of what the internet would become, thinking about how starkly different that was. Well, are there sort of things that you felt that were misjudged regarding maybe the impact of the internet?
I'm not sure that it was really misjudging, because if we think about even just the last 2 years with COVID and the way in which, I don't know what percentage of the workforce has decided that if they can't stay at home and continue to work long distance and virtually, that they prefer to resign and get another job. So in as much as in 2019, we had no idea that the whole landscape of labor was going to change. I guess I'm talking a lot about white collar. This has been happening from 2004 on, because we established the center, Duke Islamic Studies Center. So we changed the name because, at that time, Muslim Networks is not as kind of anodyne as it is now. And so it was, I think this book has to be looked at from its moment in history, because I think as things change as much as they have, not just in the last 2 years, but my goodness, over the past 17 years, I think it's important. I guess this is part of Gary Bunn's project. I think in a way we archived a moment. And especially with John Anderson's work, where he talked about where Muslims became important in the development of the internet through, most of them engineers, through their travel to Europe and to America, feeling absolutely isolated in the 70s and the 80s. So they then start to put the Quran, Hadith online, and of course, all for free, because there was zero idea that you could make money out of this. And ironically now, of course, you make money off the internet. And if you publish books, as Bruce and I foolishly continue to do, you make no money at all.
So I think the only mistake we made was to not do more in arts and music and the social expansion of. I think we had no idea how broadly the internet, or what Hodgson calls the high-tech era, would really not only travel faster, but more encompass everything, including the literary work. So as Miriam says, we still write books, and it's ironic now as the books are published, something online, but mostly Kindle and mostly downloaded for use at home. So and if you have that Russian website, you don't even need to do that. You get them all for free from Moscow.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, all virtual. So I think that we didn't make a mistake so much as none of us could have estimated in 2005 or even 2015 how engulfing the world of virtual technology would become in our lives. So
let me just quickly add there. So we were in Doha in 2010, and we were scholars in residence at the Museum of Islamic Art. And so Bruce told you about the way in which we had to change the title and be careful about Wahhabi instinct
restrictions.
Yeah.
So as a gift to our class, we gave them, at a special ceremony that introduced us, our each student got a copy of the book and we signed it.
The same one you showed. We're so pleased to see you have a paper copy in front of you. That shows your age. That you have a paper copy of this book.
So they come into class for the first class and not a single one has the book, even though we have asked them
To bring
to
the book.
read. No, we didn't. We asked them just to read a
To
couple
read
of chapters. And we're like, we gave you the books yesterday. Where are they? Oh no, we've got it. We found it online. And it was easier for them to read online than it was the book that we had rather ceremoniously given to them.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think that yeah, it's as you say, it's a snapshot in time, and I really did feel through the kind of like some of the stuff with the internet is was just spot on as to just how important it is, and in fact maybe even as you say, maybe almost underestimated just the absolute massive impact of the internet as well. And some of it, some of it I felt was kind of almost like would have made sense in 2005, but maybe doesn't make sense now, but might make sense in like 100 years. Stuff like the virtual HAJJ. I was speaking to my wife about that ultimately maybe the internet could be just as good or kind of a compensation to HAJJ. I think that at the moment, maybe back in the day, I think that the idea of the internet was a bit more physical, the idea of the internet as place more so than the idea of the internet as a network maybe was there. Like you could go to places and so on, whereas now the idea of social network, I feel plays it perhaps. But I'll tell you what, because can
I make a comment about the virtual HAJJ?
Yeah.
Because we then taught the class for a number of years using the book.
Yeah.
And we introduced one of the classes that had a number of muhajabat in the classroom. And we said, okay, so for your first project, we want you to go on a virtual HAJJ.
They almost left the class.
They all left.
They all left. They said, we can't take a class with a virtual HAJJ. There's only one HAJJ. It's real.
Okay, yeah, It's really fascinating. I think what you're highlighting there as well, especially for like the community in Glasgow, there'd be such a different reaction. They would almost, and I think it just sort of highlights ultimately the diversity and complexity of us as Muslims as well. Because I think some people would find it almost funny, initially, of a HAJJ, because whereas maybe these people think, oh, you cannot say that HAJJ and that is the same. Whereas almost people in Glasgow here might think, well, of course it's not the same. So it's not a worry. You can talk about, a virtual HAJJ, and, just this diversity of the Muslim community that I think is certainly been stamped. I think that the impact of this book has been, is certainly, I feel that in reading this book, it made a sense of a lot of the conversations that were happening in academia in 2010 when it was there, and a lot of the debates that were happening. Well, there's a couple of things to say, and I think we could probably squeeze something in, perhaps both. I think I'm quite eager to talk about the idea of the analysis. For me, the most kind of thing I took most issue with was the analysis of the terrorism through the lens of the Salafi sect, jihad as related to Salafism. Ultimately, I feel that, living in Scotland, we're very familiar with the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and so on. And I wonder if maybe I personally feel that a time where we look at terrorism as a Salafi phenomenon, not exclusively, but as intrinsically linked to Salafism, I wonder if that will pass, in an almost kind of radical way. I cannot help when I read analysis of terrorism, and there are unsophisticated ones as well, of course, and sophisticated ones, but I can't help it when reading analysis of terrorism in relation to Salafis, thinking of somebody in the 80s walking around in Belfast and saying something along the lines of, I think that the problem is the Catholics, and someone would say, well, not all Catholics, but, the ones that take it too far. you know, and ultimately this terrorism seems to be, well, put it this way, if you change the religion of, the Catholics in Northern Ireland, little would change. Likewise in ISIS and so on, this kind of anti-imperialism, starting of a modern day nation state and so on. I don't think that mission would change if they became Christian or atheist or whatever, you know. What are your feelings on the analysis of terrorism and its relationship to Salafism, which is still a talking point today?
Let me quickly respond to that. Again, I think it's so important to think about this book as archiving a moment. Yeah. Because I don't think that is true anymore. I think it was absolutely true in 2002, 2003, with, Bush attacking Afghanistan, invading Iraq, and it was all about, extremism and the dreaming up of what Muslim extremism was. But I think in a way, certainly for us in America, terrorism now is very homegrown. It's very domestic. It has nothing to do with Islam. And in an ironic way, I think domestic, white supremacist, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anti-everything is putting terrorism into the right place. And that it's extremism regardless of what the identity of the extremist is.
So the other thing I want to add to what Miriam said, I know we have very little time left, but I found one of the most interesting discussions about terrorism and how it's changed and how we think of it came from the attack on Salman Rushdie, where he was attacked at a place in New York, Chautauqua, where he was giving a talk, and somebody who was an irate Muslim attacked him and, of course, severely injured him, and he may have lost sight in one eye because of that attack. And everybody jumped in and said, here are these extremist Muslims, here they're doing this again. But it was very interesting. Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winning Turkish author, said, I deplore what happened, but let's look at the circumstances of the man who attacked him. So I think there's much more the Orhan Pamuk reaction of it. It's not just the terrorist event or the terrorist subject, but also the larger social cleavages that produce terrorism in the first place. And so I think there is that reckoning, if you will, a second look or a deeper look at what produces terrorism rather than the terrorist event itself that's now public.
Thanks very much. Well, look, as always with these events, discussions could go on for ages, and I was also looking forward to getting into feminism. I've got a little message from one of our festival organisers, Dr. Basseth Amjad, who said, Professor Lawrence's book on Sufi martyrs and the Quran in English have given me a better understanding of my Islamic roots in the Indian subcontinent. Thank you. And I think that's a fantastic wee example as well, just of the benefits of the academic study and rigorous, honest, sincere study of the world and the people, amazing people that are around us as well. Look, it leaves me just to say thank you so much, and I wish this conversation could have gone on, and we hope to maybe even see you again. And please do visit if you're in Glasgow anytime, or even Edinburgh, your old hometown as well. Okay, you're welcome in the West Coast is what I'm saying. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for a brilliant interview. We want to thank you for being so generous and so friendly.